Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, coordinator and producer for the Stop Vax Passports Task Force. Today's webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series focused on topics of concern regarding Communist Chinese pandemic response policies, including mandates for vaccines and centralized compliance tracking digital technologies, which are, we believe, a gateway to tyrannical social credit scores, surveillance, and mass population control. A video of this webinar will post to stopvaxpassports.org within a day or two of the end of our program. Our other webinars can be found there too. Please share these with your elected officials, friends, and colleagues, and other networks. During today's program, open the chat to access important links that we will share, and use the Q&A function provided by Zoom to ask questions and make comments. This webinar is playing live on Clubhouse, and we will host a post-webinar This webinar is playing live on Clubhouse, and we will host a post-webinar discussion on Clubhouse where audience members can engage with one another on this important topic. We will post the link in the chat. We are live streaming on YouTube and NTD TV. Our co-host today and moderator is Frank Gaffney. Frank is co-chair of the Stop Vax Passports Task Force, executive chairman for the Center for Security Policy, host of Securing America TV, and vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China. And with that, Frank, let's get started in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Welcome, everyone. We are going to be visiting about a subject that is both incredibly multifaceted and incredibly ominous. We're doing it under the rubric of what we call efficiency or enslavement, in the course of which we're going to be talking about elements of what really is an incoming digital gulag that will, we fear, prove not so much to be about efficiencies, but about actually enslaving, controlling, and otherwise abusing populations both abroad and here in the United States. We'll be featuring conversations about vaccine passports, something that was officially endorsed by the G20 at their summit meeting in Bali last week. Smart health cards, another term for digital health cards and platforms, in short, for containing and transmitting personal details, business relationships, other social interfaces, and of course, a host of information about one's health and record. What we're going to talk about as well is digital driver's licenses, real IDs, as well as the so-called central bank digital currencies, and how each of these building blocks for a digital gulag will interface with one another to help achieve the end, unfortunately, if their proponents have their way, of our constitutional republic and the freedoms it guarantees. To speak about these issues, we've assembled a remarkable panel of experts. Some of them are familiar to you if you've been following these programs. Some of them may be new resources that we highly commend to you. One that is in the familiar category is, of course, our co-host and the co-chairman of our Stop Vaccine Passports Task Force, the inimitable Reggie Littlejohn, founder and president of a wonderful organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. She's also a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, and an attorney by training, a litigator of great skill, and one of our time's leading freedom fighters. We're very proud to call her both a friend as well as a very valued colleague, and to welcome her as ever to help set the stage for our conversation today. Reggie Littlejohn, welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you so very much, Frank. Well, we are here really to sound the alarm that we are about to be trapped in a digital gulag that is set by digital IDs and a central bank digital currency together. So as Americans, we are at extreme risk right now of losing basically all of our freedoms, from financial privacy to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, even freedom of thought, freedom of expression. And we are in great danger of falling into a situation like the China social credit system. So this can be achieved through the vaccine passport, which we have discussed. But these so-called vaccine passports, I feel like this vaccine passport task force has played a major role, along with others, in making the word vaccine passport radioactive. So they're not calling it vaccine passport anymore. They're calling it a smart health card or a digital ID. Or it doesn't matter what, any mandatory digital platform, such as a digital driver's license, can be used to enable the China social credit system. And what that is it's a way of taking everything together, monitoring everything, centralizing it into a central database so that everything about you is attached to this digital ID and tracked. So that means your spending habits, your facial recognition, your real-time geolocation, where you are, your entire internet search history, your internet spending history, your medical history, including your vaccination status, your criminal history, including whether or not you've jaywalked. All of that is together, and it comes up with a score. If you have a high score, you can lead what looks like a normal life, but you're a slave, because if you step out of line, your score will go down. And when it goes down, things happen like you lose your job. Your kid won't go to a good school. You won't be able to travel. You won't be able to borrow money. If it goes down further, in China, they will shut you off from your money. You will have no access to your bank account or your credit cards. And if it goes down even further, if you really become a problem to the government in China, you can just be disappeared. Now, the reason that this is so frightening at this very moment is that the G20 has said that they want the world to adopt an interoperable international vaccine passport. And that will support this system globally. And not only that, but at the same time, the Biden administration has issued Executive Order 14067, which is, well, they call it the first ever comprehensive framework for responsible development of digital assets. But what it really is it is calling for a central bank digital currency. So something that's important to understand about the central bank digital currency is that it's not the same as Bitcoin. It's because Bitcoin is private, it's decentralized. Central bank digital currency is one currency for everyone, and it is run by and controlled by the central bank of whatever government you're in our case, the United States government. And there are, Beijing has been pushing for this, the Bank of England has been pushing for it, and the International Monetary Fund has been pushing for it. In fact, there's a woman who recently, in the International Monetary Fund, her name is Cecilia Skingsley, the head of the Innovation Hub of the Bank of International Settlement, said at a meeting of the International Monetary Fund that a CBDC, central bank digital currency, is not a universal solution, but should instead come together with digital IDs in a package. And she said, I think we need to be a little bit bold here in the sense that we shouldn't get in the way of the private sector. But I think sometimes in history, you have to push society to new equilibriums. So what are these new equilibriums that they're trying to push society to through this confluence of central bank digital currency and vaccine passports or international IDs? Something that is true about a central bank digital currency is that it is programmable. That's something they don't like to mention. But what does that mean to have a programmable centralized currency? If it's a centralized currency, and if you're living in a cashless society, that centralized currency is the only way you can buy things. And if it's programmable, they can program what you can buy and what you can't buy. They can decide that your money is not going to be available until a certain date, and that it will expire after a certain other date. So they can force you to spend money during a certain period of time. They can connect it to your carbon footprint, so that, for example, if you already flew somewhere for the wedding of a friend, but then you have a family member who dies, maybe you won't be able to go to your family member's funeral because you already expended your carbon allowance going to the wedding of your friend. All right. They could program it in accordance with your health. Let's say that you have high cholesterol. They could say, guess what? You don't get to buy that hamburger that you wanted. You go to you have your hamburger, you go to the cash register and you can't buy it because they have decided your cholesterol is too high and you shouldn't be eating this. I mean, this is a way of, or they could just empty your bank account if they wanted to, if they want to punish you. Another thing about this central bank or this vaccine passport being promulgated by the G20 is they say that it's very important to combat disinformation. So what constitutes disinformation? Okay, it would be being counter-narrative, for example, on the vaccines. So, for example, when the COVID first came out and they said that there wasn't any human-to-human transmission, saying that there was human-to-human transmission would be disinformation. You could be punished for that. And then, of course, later on, we find out that, of course, there was human-to-human transmission. And you could just go down the litany of all the false things that we were told about the virus and about early treatment, about the efficacy and the safety of the vaccines. Anyone who counters that would be censored. And we've already begun with that in the United States. In fact, it's pretty far down the road. Most recently, Dr. Peter McCullough, who I believe is the most published cardiologist in the history of the world, has had his medical license suspended because of quote unquote disinformation that he's been saying about COVID and its treatment. If it can happen to him, it can happen to any one of us. So according to the Atlantic Council's central bank digital currency tracker, there are 11 countries who've already launched this. 15 countries who have pilot programs, of which, 20 countries who are in development, and 46 are in research. So that's probably the majority of the countries in the world that are in the process of researching or launching or have launched this. And what this constitutes is basically global digital gulag, or let's even call it a globalist digital gulag, where we're going to be surveilled through these vaccine passports and controlled through these central bank digital currencies. So taken together, the push for the central bank digital currencies that the Biden administration and others are pushing for with these vaccine passports or international digital IDs are the digital gulag staring us in the face. And if we do not resist now, and this trap is sprung, then in the future, there will be no resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie Littlejohn. This is an excellent overview and introduction to some of the topics we're going to be drilling down on a bit now with other members of our panel. The first of whom joining us by video, as he was unable to be here in person via Zoom, is Dr. Robert Malone, another of the extraordinary medical practitioners who has been in the forefront of challenging the official narratives about the vaccines and about, most especially, their deleterious impact on the population that has been subjected to them. He is a man with considerable credentials for making these criticisms. Among other things, he is the inventor of the mRNA technology that it is at the heart of these, well, gene therapies, to be more precise, not actually vaccines in the traditional sense. Dr. Malone is the author of a new and best-selling book, Lies My Government Told Me, and the Better Future Coming. We've asked him to address the topic of the corrupt institutions that are wresting control of the masses. Let's go to the videotape with Dr. Malone now.
Hello, this is Robert Malone, and I'm very glad for this opportunity to participate in this webinar entitled Efficiency or Enslavement: Smart Health Cards, Digital Driver's Licenses, and Central Bank Digital Currency. In particular, in my section, I'm going to speak on corrupt institutions wresting control of the masses. What we've observed over the last 3 years of the COVID crisis has been a great test example of how these technologies of digital passports, digital ID, central bank digital currency, controlled currency, virtual currency can be used as instruments of control and instruments of censorship. And in particular, the perfect example is what happened during the truckers' resistance in Canada, when Justin Trudeau tried a series of really tricks, including infiltration and false flag operations, etc., to try to discredit the truckers. But in the end, in response to the threat of their honking and parking their trucks, what he and his finance minister decided to do was to weaponize the entire Canadian banking system. They blocked the ability of others from the United States or Canada to donate capital to the truckers, either directly as cash transfers through various programs such as GoFundMe, and indirectly through cybercurrency. And the decision was made at the end, apparently, by the government in Canada to make it so that none of those that were involved in any way in supporting the truckers or participating directly were able to access their bank accounts. I think that was a wake-up call for the entire world when they saw that, and it almost crashed the Canadian banking system, because the thesis had been up to that point that Canadian banks were a safe harbor if you were, for instance, a wealthy Chinese person facing the risk of suddenly having all of your capital withdrawn by the CCP in response to some perception of corruption or any excuse that the CCP wished to take to seize your assets. And so it had become the norm in China for the wealthy entrepreneurs to offshore their capital. And in particular, the Canadian banking system was one of their favorite places to stash. And when Trudeau and his finance minister, both trained through the Young Leaders Program of the World Economic Forum, decided to shut off access to bank accounts arbitrarily with basically a push of the button, it alerted the entire world to the threat associated with this strategy, and in particular, the threat associated with central bank digital currency. And now what we have is the rollout of that in a staged fashion, both in a limited way in the United States, in a less limited way in Canada, and then, of course, across Europe, in conjunction with the thrust to implement digital IDs in kind of the camel's nose for the digital ID movement has been the logic of vaccine passports. And the way this is played out is, well, who could argue about the need for health safety and the need to have identities for individuals that can be surveyed by third parties? So, for instance, if you go into a restaurant, you can tell whether or not the people in the restaurant have all been vaccinated. That's the logic. And if you're a public health official, you can control the ability of people to leave their home or participate in commerce, take their children to school, or any of these other things, depending on their current vaccine status. And many of us that have been staying alert and awake here have been tracking this and are very aware that this logic of implementation of health passports or vaccine passports, these are the two words used to describe the system, would likely lead quickly to the employment of a social credit system and tie into commerce and banking activities, and that all of us that participate in this would be soon at risk for having the arbitrary and capricious actions of our governments restricting our ability to access capital, just as was done by Trudeau and his finance minister in Canada. And that's the threat that's currently facing us, is the logic that this suite of technologies, potentially coupled to whether it's national or a global central bank digital currency, potentially managed at the top level by the Bank of International Settlements, could be implemented to completely control the ability of individuals to travel, to engage in commerce, and to engage in free speech. So that if you speak out in ways that are not approved by the current administration of your nation state or others, then your ability to engage in the normal activities of life, buy food, buy fuel, run your car, travel to a destination to visit your family or whatever, could be readily restricted, basically with a push of a button. The term that's used for this often is reducing the friction in implementing these kinds of punishments. And that's what we're all facing right now, is this level of risk if these policies are implemented.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malone. As we have made clear, when Robert Malone speaks, people listen, and they need to, especially when it comes to these matters of the abuse of technology. We've seen it with respect to the mRNA technology, for example. And now there's the distinct prospect, as he points out, that these vaccine passports, digital smart health cards, and the like will be equally abused. To discuss further this topic of the G20 and its endorsement of the vaccine passport concept, advanced at the moment by the World Health Organization, I'm very pleased to say we have with us Leo Hohmann, a man who has had a distinguished career as an investigative journalist, publishing in any number of important outlets, including Front Page Magazine, LifeSite News, The Drudge Report, Global Research, Gateway Pundit, and WorldNet Daily. He is also the author of Stealth Invasion, a really important book about the early stages of the immigration crisis, something on which he has been a specialist for years. We've asked Leo Hohmann to discuss with us this topic of what the G20 has now done in its declaration endorsing vaccine passports and effectively putting in motion mandates for their use pursuant to the direction of the World Health Organization and its Director General, Tedros Ghebreyesus, a, proxy for, puppet of the Chinese Communist Party. Leo Hohmann, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Frank, so much for having me back on. The problem, as I see it, is most Americans still don't see the face of the enemy. And because they don't see who exactly the enemy is, they cooperate with it on a daily basis. The enemy's much bigger than Biden or even the Biden administration. Yes, it lives in the usual places, Washington, D.C., New York City, San Francisco, but it also lives within smaller cities. And in fact, it's right inside most of our own homes. It's inside our cars. It has a connection to your laptop, your cell phone, your Ring doorbell system, your Alexa, your robot vacuum cleaner. your digitally equipped refrigerator, your smart meter utility connection, your doctor's office, your health insurance plan, your retirement plan, your children's schools, many of our churches, and the boardrooms of the major companies that we work for. As the world now stands, it is everywhere. It's digital, it's connected. Some are calling it the Internet of Eyes. By the end of 2022, this year, there will be 1 billion of these eyes, high-resolution digital cameras connected to the internet in cities across the world. This is what I call the beast system. Right now, there's dozens of pilot programs being launched around the world on how to create and manage this new digital control. It's basically a control grid. The New York Fed just announced last week that they have a pilot program going on where they're going to be working with about a half a dozen big banks to look into the logistics of creating a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. The G20 leaders issued a statement last week on the need for digital health passports, as Reggie had already talked about. So the leaders of the G20, this is the 20 largest economies in the world, all agreed that this is a good thing and something that we should strive to implement on a global basis. We must get the word out, folks. The vaccine passports of 2021 are not dead. That was just a dry run, in my opinion, for what's coming if we let them get away with it. Have you heard any of the candidates in last week's election talking about this? I haven't. Also, just in the last few days, Scotland's government announced they're rolling out a new digital ID platform, a single ID number that will be required to access all public services. That includes Social Security, the national healthcare system, banking. It will be all connected, and Experian credit scoring company is going to have a tie-in to this system, if that tells you anything. Canada has been working on a similar program, which they were openly advertising last year. They will be selling the digital ID to the public based on 3 key words: safety, security, and convenience. Whenever you hear one or more of these 3 words connected to a new digital product, run from it. It's part of the ruse to draw you into a global surveillance system that will lead to a social credit scoring system along the lines of what China already has in place. The infrastructure for this system, folks, is already largely in place in America and in the Western world. We just don't know it yet. It's a well-known fact that Joe Biden is, as Frank has rightly called him on several occasions. I've heard Frank Gaffney call him a, quote, wholly owned subsidiary of the CCP. But we ended up with Joe. France keeps ending up with Macron, Canada with Trudeau, New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern, the Netherlands with Mark Rutte. You see the pattern? Every one of these Western leaders is a stooge of the World Economic Forum, which is the driving force behind the digital global ID system and the global digital money system that they're trying to get in place to replace cash. And as Reggie mentioned, it's not just digital, it's programmable. It's well past time that we realize the governments of the formerly free world are no longer representing their people or their countries. They're selling us off using our data as a commodity to the highest bidders in the tech industries. None of them should be in power. Most were installed illegitimately. We personally, as human beings, are being viewed by these technocratic elites at the G20 as nothing more than human capital, raw material like any other physical asset, not unique human beings with a soul and a free will. And they now have robots to do most of the jobs that we humans used to do. This is where the climate agenda comes into play. It's not about the environment. It's about depopulating the world and increasing the level of control over our lives among those of us who remain. We still have time to defeat this beast system, but time is running short. We are going to see a convergence in the months ahead. 2023 is going to be a key year where we see a convergence of the digital dollars with the digital ID system. When this happens, the beast system will be fully built out with a full-blown social credit scoring system. Most of it has already been built out, especially on the digital ID front. They just need to do more work on the digital money system, and then they will marry the two together, and bingo, we all become slaves. This is the social credit scoring system, and it will eventually be used to kick you out of the system if you don't obey and submit to the system's values. Now, what are these values? They've already told us. Abortion on demand, no questions asked, from the entire 9 months right up to birth. No male or female, just various forms of hybrids and transgenders. No First Amendment rights, because remember, we don't have a free will or a soul. No private property rights. Cars are bad. Acreage is bad. Land is bad. And what you do on land is bad. Things like burning wood in your fireplace, that's bad. No bodily autonomy. You must prove your vaccine status. You must eat bugs. No freedom of movement, no privacy, no public services. That includes healthcare, social security, etc., without a digital ID. So we need to prepare for life outside this system. And because if they're successful, they will eventually kick you out of the system anyway. This is the resurrection, in my opinion, of the Tower of Babel and the Babylonian system. It does have a spiritual element to it, which I won't get into here today. But how do we prepare for it? Get back to basics. Think at a micro level. We're so used to thinking at a macro level. Who are we going to get in the White House? Who are we going to get in the U.S. Senate seats? This idea that in order to defeat the cabal, we must get Trump elected or we must get DeSantis elected. That would be nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. I truly believe we are entering a post-election global system. And even if it did happen, do any of the politicians really understand this system? We must also develop a keen eye for the enemy's tentacles, and then we must also develop an iron will to say no. We won't go along with any element of this techno-totalitarian system. Because in the end, even if we do end up with Trump or DeSantis in the White House, we'll still have big banks, big tech, big pharma, and the rest of the corporate superstructure trying to drive us into the beast system. In the end, they don't care if they get your vote, as long as they get your obedience. Thanks, folks.
Well, as dystopian visions go, that's a pretty full-on one. And Leo, thank you for both laying it before us, the beast system, as you call it, and doing so with such clarity and such evidence that cannot be ignored, that's for sure. We're going to turn next to a man with deep experience inside big tech. Speaking of the corporate superstructure, he actually is a refugee from it, a man who fled Google after some 8 years working in its software engineering spaces and those of YouTube. He left the building with, as I recall, something like 900 documents that were stunningly depictive of what Google is up to. His name is Zach Voorhees. He is a whistleblower. He has shed important light on the inner workings and ambitions of one of the most monstrous of these big tech operations. And we've asked him to talk about its insights, what we can draw from it in terms of how big tech can be weaponized to punish those who would stand up to its predations. Zach, thank you so much for what you've done to expose the true nature of these big tech operations and for shedding further light on their implications for the topics we're discussing today. Welcome. And over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Didi, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. For those looking at some of the best slides about Google and what their intentions are, I would point to a slide that I exposed, which was designed by Google's AI ethicist, which laid out a 4-step process of how individuals are programmed. And it starts with the collection of information, which is then aggregated, filtered, re-ranked, and at the last step, people like us are programmed. And then this process repeats in a cycle so that the Overton window gets eventually shifted towards the corporate goals of Google. This was not just in one slide. This was in several different slides within Google. It's very clear that they are using their search engine, their access to their customers through YouTube, through video, through news, in order to essentially, in their words, program people like us. And the reason why that they're doing this is because it's, in my opinion, that they've been directed to do this through a process called machine learning fairness, which did not originate from Google. It actually originated from the Institutes of Academia. It was first designed in a university, Stanford, and it went from Stanford into Google, and then from Google, it started to be filtered into all of their different products slowly at first, and then it started to ramp up into sort of the mess that you see today. This program that Google is using in order to censor the information is called machine learning fairness. And this machine learning fairness is essentially using applied AI techniques in order to filter all of the information that you see. And it's trained through collecting massive amounts of data and then being ranked by human raters. And then once there is a data lake of information, this is then fed through machine learning fairness to generate what's called classifiers. These classifiers are AI neural nets. When they get novel input, they compare it to the past data sets that Google has collected in order to come up with a response. Right now, a lot of that is being applied as labels to data, and then those labels are being used as kind of like a social credit system on data. And if it doesn't pass muster, then the information is dropped to the back pages of Google search or eliminated altogether. This machine learning fairness is something that is being copied by other institutions. The big social media networks are essentially doing something similar with their artificial intelligence and their filtering. And first it starts with text-based posts, but then it moves to memes, images, and all of this different content that exists on the internet. Apple announced a few years ago that they were going to start searching through all of the users' photographs on their Apple device, specifically their iPhone, iOS, in order to search for what they called, child exploitation material. But I believe that the real reason is that they want to be able to get their foot in the door so that they can search, your photos to see, and profile the individual users. Because essentially, if, big tech can peer into, your private repositories of information, then they're able to generate a very high degree of profiling on what the user's tendencies are going to be. And it's my opinion that this is going to form the basis of a social credit score. When you go to a bank to get a loan, or if you want to pass a toll bridge, essentially this information is going to be aggregated and collected, and then they're going to make the decision about whether you can pass or whether you can get a loan or whether you can get an increase in the central bank digital cash and currency based upon how much of a compliant individual that you are. And what's really scary is that this social credit system is not going to be siloed on the individual user. There are indications from China that this also extends to your family and your friends, such that if you are dissident, if you are counter narrative, if you don't go along with whatever the current thing is, then it's not just going to be you that's going to be punished. It's going to be your entire social network, which then turns your social network against you in order to have, it basically turns your friends into ideological commissars that are going to be using their influence in order to silence those that go against the system. This is essentially what's coming. And right now, a lot of the social credit score aspects of our society are siloed away on different websites. You can go to Yelp, that's one. What Google chooses to rank is another. What your credit score is, that's another silo. But what I think is going to happen, in the course of the next decade is that you're going to start seeing the centralization of this information, so that instead of having a bunch of different data points spread out across these different tech companies, it's going to be centralized so that you get one score. And this one score is going to be used to figure out whether, you need to have your movement, limited. We already see that this is happening in China, where there was a bank run, and when people went to protest against the bank, what they found is that suddenly they were not able to enter in trains. They were not able to transport themselves, to the location or to protest in person. As a lot of these Chinese dissidents said, is that essentially what this was a digital form of handcuffs. And I believe that this is a test run for what's coming to America and the rest of the world. Another thing that's very frightening is the fact that China is rolling out a new justice system that's based on artificial intelligence, where essentially, you get sentenced based upon a hidden algorithm, and there's essentially no chance for appeal. Like, yes, you can appeal. Yes, you can have a decision looked at by another computer algorithm, but if it also says no, then you don't really have any indication of why that is. Essentially, it's because the computer said so, and no one's got any power in order to challenge that otherwise. And the question is, well, why wouldn't this happen here? And it's my opinion that it will. We need to, essentially push back against this, because if this is allowed to go into our system, then it's game over for humanity. It's essentially taking the human out of the decision-making loop at every instance of our society.
Wow. Zach Voorhees, thank you. This melding of big tech in the United States and that being honed and weaponized in communist China is a hugely important point. I think especially as we've sort of touched on thus far in this program, and certainly in others of this series, the China model that was instituted in the name of pandemic response that introduced these various unprecedented steps, mask mandates, lockdowns, quarantines, vaccine untested, inadequately tested at the very least, and then mandated and then enforced by vaccine passports, all have their links back to China. And Zach, you've introduced more of what we can anticipate will be coming from that quarter and from its helpmates as they try to institute things like these algorithms, artificial intelligence, and the like in our own country. One of the ways in which that may well be advanced is in the form of so-called smart digital driver's licenses, if you will, the idea of real IDs baked into their various chips and other technologies will be various personal data, eye recognition, and perhaps much more. And fingerprints, to be sure. What we're talking about is a facet of what has been bequeathed going back to the Patriot Act which I must say at the time seemed to me to be something that was sensible. And as it has been manipulated and abused since, has become more and more a source of concern. To talk about all of this, I'm very pleased to reintroduce our friend and colleague, Didi Laugesen. She is the executive secretary of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, also the executive director of the Save the Persecuted Christians Coalition, a woman of great capacity and deep faith and conviction about human freedom, and she fights for it every single day. We're very proud to have her as one of the core members of our team with the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and of course with this task force, which she helps manage for Reggie and me. We've asked her to talk about taking the digital gulag on the road, which is the practical effect of these digital driver's licenses, we fear. Didi Laugesen, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks, Reggie. As a task force, we've been tracking since the beginning of the pandemic the rise of and development of vaccine passports. We've also been expressing our concern that not only would they be recommended, but vaccine passports would indeed be mandated for travel and in other areas of life. We saw this in action throughout 2021 as experimental vaccines were forced on populations by their governments. Tracking and tracing GPS technologies were experimented with throughout the lockdowns, and as communities began to reopen. All of this technology presents real and growing threats, as we've heard today, to privacy and freedom. It is sold to constituents as a necessity for the common good, and they will benefit society with its sheer efficiency. But what these digitized platforms and tracking technologies are all about is counting, tracking, and controlling populations from a centralized position of governance. It enables and will allow for the digital enslavement of the world's population by unaccountable international organizations and partnerships, like, as we've heard, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the G20, and the World Economic Forum, to whom governments all over the world are submitting their sovereignty as a consequence of China having exported the COVID pandemic to the world and influencing worldwide adoption of the extraordinary destructive China model, imposition of lockdowns, travel restrictions, contact tracing, and social credit scores. As we've heard, the leaders at the G20 have just this month signed a declaration including the development of global vaccine passports. These technocratic elites, as Leo called them, said COVID presented an opportunity for a great reset that shouldn't be missed. And so new control technologies and tools are being fed into the system at an explosive and alarming rate. These developments and adoption of them are happening often behind the scenes and without public input or consideration of regulations to protect privacy, medical freedom, the right to associate, freedom of speech, and other civil rights. The technologies and policies needed to support and such potentially invasive and controlling systems have been in work for a long time. Take, for instance, digital driver's licenses. UpgradePoints.com has been tracking states that are moving ahead with supplemental digital driver's licenses. In September and October, I was invited by my state government, Colorado, to get my digital driver's license. A digital driver's license, or DDL, also known as a mobile driver's license, MDL, is a supposedly secure digital version of your physical driver's license or ID card that can be stored on your cell phone in your digital wallet. They say a DDL is beneficial and efficient because the DDL allows you to access your ID even if you leave your wallet or purse at home. Most Americans will eventually have a DDL on their phones and other devices. Both iPhone and Android users can already store things like credit cards, plane tickets, hotel keys, and even event tickets in digital wallets And in the same way, a DDL grants you access to your license or ID on your device. The DDL isn't just a digital copy or screenshot of your driver's license. The technology works with your state government to set up and verify your identity digitally through an app on your smartphone. To have one, you will be required to let the government host software on your devices. DDLs have been mandated by the Real ID Act, formulated in the wake of September 11th and passed by Congress in 2005. The Real ID Act was passed to set standards for the issuance of sources of identification, such as driver's licenses. The Act established a minimum security standards for state-issued driver's licenses and identification cards, and it prohibits federal agencies from accepting licenses and identification cards from states that do not meet these standards for official purposes. It was aimed at eliminating airline terrorism by increasing requirements to obtain documents granting access to domestic planes. State agencies that issue licenses or identification cards, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, require more paperwork regarding proof of residency and Social Security numbers under the Act than previously necessary. And all states need to comply by May 3rd of 2023. The State Department of Homeland Security is working to help create standards for mobile driver's licenses, known as ISO 18013-5 MDL. And the TSA is working with Apple to accept a version of an iPhone-based digital ID to be used at the airports. At a state level, many states have already begun rolling out digital driver's licenses that are compatible with Apple Wallet. Since states are generally responsible for issuing licenses and ID cards, whether or not you'll have access and when will depend on where you live. So the states that are already offering DDLs and others in the testing phase include Arizona. Arizona is currently using the mobile ID app developed by IDEMIA. Arizona will be among the first states in the country to introduce compatibility with Apple Wallet for Apple. I contacted a state legislator in Arizona to see who was tracking the development there, and he was surprised to even find out about it, didn't know about it. So this is really something that citizens don't know about, and even our elected leaders are in the dark about. Colorado's been accepting digital licenses using the My Colorado app since 2019. In 2020, the Colorado State Patrol also started accepting them as well. In Connecticut is working with Apple to develop virtual IDs that work with Apple Wallet. Delaware is currently using mobile ID. Florida has launched a pilot for the Florida Smart ID in 2021. Georgia will be among one of the first states in the country to introduce the Apple Wallet. And it is Iowa is working with Apple as well. Kentucky is working with Apple and should be rolling out soon. Louisiana's LA Wallet app launched in 2018 and provides a digital driver's license accepted by the state police. Maryland is using Apple. New York uses its Excelsior Pass COVID-19 vaccine passport system, which will include driver's licenses. According to a New York Times report, Oklahoma is currently using the mobile ID app, and Utah also is working with Apple ID. And California and New Jersey have pending bills to create digital versions of IDs and driver's licenses. So it is definitely being put in place. While it's the biggest in terms of rollout at the moment, it's Apple isn't the only one that is developing these platforms. Google is working on a way to store digital driver's licenses, and last fall, a program called the Android Ready SE Alliance that sets privacy and security standards for third-party developers to deal with IDs on mobile devices is in play. IBM had been working in this sector, but they've been quiet for a while. Security and privacy concerns related to DDLs. Specific to Apple, it notes that driver's licenses and state IDs and wallet take full advantage of the privacy and security built into iPhone and Apple Watch. Of course, Apple products are largely produced in China. So naturally, there's concern there may be unknown data mining backdoors and insecurities not being considered. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, reports digital driver's licenses raise a number of privacy and equity concerns and should be adopted only if they incorporate available privacy protecting technologies, and steps are taken to ensure that they are not made mandatory and do not lead to a society of ubiquitous ID checks, according to a new report by the American Civil Liberties Union published today. The report, Identity Crisis, What Digital Driver's Licenses Could Mean for Privacy, Equity, and the Future of American Life, analyzes the current push. And they say that the big privacy concerns, there's 7 of them. Law enforcement could use digital driver's license verification as a pretext to search people's devices. Records of digital ID checks could be held in a centralized database and allow for tracking of our everyday activities. The Department of Motor Vehicles and other issuing agency could instantly and remotely revoke your driver's license, exacerbating existing abusive practices of driver's license suspension, says the ACLU. Digital driver's licenses could be used to amass data about ID holders by private companies without your knowledge or consent. Digital driver's licenses could limit personal control over the data that ID holders release. Hackers could exploit the adoption of digital driver's licenses, and digital ID holders could be forced to install government software on their phones. These are valid concerns. Recently in Colorado, on October 5th, it was reported that the Colorado State Portal had been taken offline by an anonymous foreign cyber attack. Multiple states were affected. The portal was down for an extended period of time, over a week. It is unknown who the assailant was or what they were after. Nonetheless, this certainly compounds concerns that the information stored with our digital driver's licenses is not secure from tyrannical abuse or foreign or state actors with malign intent. Congress and state legislators must do more to ensure our information is secure and our privacy and civil rights are protected at all times. DDLs like vaccine passports and a centralized digital bank currency must not be mandated. Thanks so much, Frank.
Didi, thank you for that really comprehensive assessment of this particular topic. It's generated a number of questions from our audience, one of which is, will this video be available after the screening? Yes, it will. We do a little post-production editing on it. Usually our colleague Oleg manages to turn these around within hours. Check with the Stop Vax Passport site to find the video there, and probably at our 2 sponsoring organizations as well, Committee on the Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org, as well as the Women's Rights Without Frontiers.org. Didi, again, the request has been made for sort of a distillation of this material, and it might be that that your notes could be readily turned into such a précis, and we'll encourage you to do that. We're going to turn to our cleanup batter next. Her name is Connie Elliott. She is a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, and an extraordinary resource on issues of totalitarianism versus freedom. She has been imbued with an understanding of all of this from her family's experience being forcibly put on the road, fleeing tyranny, in the case of her mother from Vietnam, in successive nations, as I recall. So she brings to this a passion for freedom that is both inspiring and always informative. We've asked her to sort of tie all that we've heard so far together and give us some ideas, as members of our audience have requested, about, given these dire tidings, what can we do? Connie Elliott, over to you.
Thanks, Frank. So what does this all mean? Over the past several years, and as you've heard over the course of this webinar, many people have been putting their hands around an architecture of control, all of which are aimed at subverting and ending our ability to enjoy our constitutionally enumerated freedoms. Each piece of the system appears innocuous, but put together, when all the parts can interact, the system enables an insight into our behavior and a granular level of control that is really beyond all of Orwell's most frightening imaginings. The logic of the system Zach discussed earlier is a top-down system of information flow and control. We've seen it, the military use it and call it the digital kill chain. From Zach, I got this slide, which I'll scan and give to Oleg later, that details the logic. Training data are harvested by AIs that monitor the system. They use this information to program algorithms. Media are classified, filtered, aggregated, or generated, and ultimately people are programmed. And anybody who is not programmed is fed back into the data lake so that the system can go again and again and again and either program us or excise us from the system, turning us into blanks, unable to interact with our money or participate in the economy of the system. Through the digital driver's licenses that Didi explained to us, we have a direct question about our ability to enjoy our Third Amendment rights against ordering. The Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that computers are the digital equivalent of our homes. And by being forced to house software on that device, whether we want to or not, just in order to participate in the system at all, we're effectively being forced to quarter assets of this digital control system. And once it's in place, we don't know if the private entities involved will actually protect our data. Apple and Google were both forced recently to pay large settlements because they collected data on us without our knowledge or consent, or even when we had set settings to prevent it. Reggie, in her introduction, hit at the heart of how a central bank digital currency is a dagger aimed at the very heart of the American experiment. The early abolitionists understood that unless one could enjoy the fruits of one's labor, fruits we store as money, we're not free. Thomas Jefferson embedded this idea in its most radical form into the American DNA when he said that the right to pursue happiness is fundamental and inalienable. Whose happiness, you ask? Your happiness for you, my happiness for me. In fact, in all of human history, the only nation to answer the question, who chooses? With the answer, you choose for you, and I choose for me, is the United States of America. Dr. Malone explained to us in his segment that access to money has already been used to target basic free speech. And as Leo Hohmann explained to us, on the heels of Biden Executive Order 14067, the Fed has joined with Visa and MasterCard and banks to begin a central bank digital experiment here in the US, exposing us to the joys of programmable money and of being locked out of the system, introduced to us as digital soma, here for our convenience. So what is to be done? The first thing that you can do is develop a pattern eye. Look for the pieces of the system. And that's what we are trying to give you in these webinars, is the ability to see the individual elements so that you can assemble them in your mind and understand that it's an entire system and architecture of control. Part of the pattern that we're seeing is that assembling and denying the ability to form mass and form large groups is an aspect of war. And that ability is being denied us by the system. We need to ask, are the controllers of that system then at war with us? We need to know that the authorities, the legal authorities, and the budget accounts needed to execute these systems are being snuck into our laws right now, and they're being done at the state level, below the level where most of us usually have the ability to apply scrutiny. We must dissent. We must inform our servants, our magistrates, and our public servants that we dissent, that we do not want them to authorize our government to have these powers. You can begin by going to our Align Act campaign, which is on the page for this webinar at stopvaxpassports.org. The die is cast. The bars of the cage are in place, but the door is still open. And now it's up to us to choose. Will we be free or will we submit? Thank you.
Amen. Connie Elliott, thank you. Calls for action, for sure. We're going to take a few questions now, and some I'm deriving from inputs from our audience, some from other sources. I wanted just to say at the outset that the comments about Canada are particularly striking. I had an opportunity to interview earlier today Christine Douglas Williams, a very accomplished journalist in Canada, who has been following closely what the Trudeau government has been doing, both in the run-up to the truckers' protest, in its course, the efforts to suppress it, and since. And it's really instructive, I think, for all of us here south of that border with Canada, because one of the things that has now just, I think in the past few days, come to light is that Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergency Act that essentially gives him almost limitless power to crack down and to otherwise control the people of Canada was not, as he had claimed, something that was sought by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or by its counterparts in the intelligence services. It was instead something that he chose to do on his own. And as a result of having done it, we have been treated to the full horrors of what we're forecasting may be headed our way. The kind of, well, social credit system, yes. The kind of manipulation of bank accounts, yes. The kind of suppression of freedom of speech, yes. The kind of control of the right to protect oneself with firearms, yes. All now part of the daily lot in life of Canadians, to the point where people speaking critically of these actions risk being penalized, perhaps even incarcerated. Could that happen here? And I would ask the question, I think, of you, Connie Elliott, based on your firsthand understanding of the work of totalitarians, if it's happened to a nation very much like our own, at least until recently, is your assessment that what Trudeau has done could well be adopted by Biden and company here?
It's not impossible. The resulting, I would tell you that the extraterritorial detainments that became the norm during the global war on terror could be interpreted or viewed as a dry run, an experiment of how the state would justify having the legal authorities to do that to American citizens. But the one thing that we do have that the Canadians don't is that we have a constitution that protects our rights first, that enumerates specific rights. And so the legal hurdle to doing these things is higher. The question is, how long is everybody going to care about the law? I don't know the answer to that question. And as I've said to you in the past, we're going to have an interesting time finding out. Mm-hmm. I hope that respect for the law remains.
But it has to be equal justice under the law for that respect to be deserved, doesn't it? And that's very much in question at the moment. Leo Hohmann, you had a very interesting sort of juxtaposition between the comment that Joe Biden, well, you were quoting me, I guess, for that matter, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand, and that he and others leading G20 nations seem to be now stooges of the World Economic Forum. How does the Chinese communists on the one hand and the, well, globalists, I guess one calls them, of the World Economic Forum interact and, well, collaborate for that matter?
Yeah, I think they do it on policy. Right now, we're talking about the big thing, in 2020 and 2021 was COVID. And now it's all about what? Climate change. Well, isn't it interesting that you don't see any climate hysteria in China? I think that's because they know that the Chinese people are already conquered. They're already compliant, 100% compliant. They have these cameras literally that I was talking about, the 2 billion cameras. A lot of them are in China. They're on every street corner. They're on every light post. They're outside every apartment complex and even inside. They don't need China to comply with the New World Order. They're already fully compliant. And that's why you see these globalists, who are mostly the ones from the World Economic Forum, are folks, so-called leaders and business leaders from Western Europe, Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, what I call the formerly free world. They need to get us into compliance. That's what it's all about. And you see these leaders going off to the, Davos every year to consult with Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum. You see it in the G20 meeting last week, where they're all singing from the same song sheet on how we need to reinstitute digital health passports. So it seems like they're all on board with the same script. And then China's allowed to do its own thing. Russia's allowed to do its own thing. Of course, they're on the outs right now with this system. But it's a war between globalism as it already exists in China and Russia, totalitarianism, and how they want it to exist here in the United States, Canada, and these other European countries. The question is, will we allow them?
Mm-hmm. War is an interesting term. It seems to me that actually the globalists and the Chinese Communist Party, and, well, for that matter, another of the groups that you focused on for years, the Sharia supremacists, the Islamists, I guess,
fully on board,
are all, working on a common intermediate step, which is the one you just talked about, taking down the United States. They may have different end states in mind, but for the moment, they're making common
That's
cause.
a great point, Frank, because the Islamic countries are fully on board with what is called fintech. That is the financial element of all of this Green New Deal, smart smart economy, sustainability stuff that we see going on at the World Economic Forum and the UN. The Islamic countries want to be the chief financiers of all of it.
Right. Great points, Leo. Let me turn to Zach Voorhees. Zach, you talked about something that I was struck by not so long ago. Profiling was a dirty word. You engaged in it at your peril. You could be certainly criticized and even canceled, I think, if you engaged in it. And now, according to your analysis, profiling is happening on a industrial scale with big tech and algorithms and humans out of the loop, for that matter, doing that kind of quantum analysis, I guess, of the vast big data that is now being hoovered up, notably, but not exclusively, by the Chinese Communist Party. How have we gotten to this point, Zach, that what was unacceptable just a short while ago is now being practiced on this mind-boggling global scale?
This is a question that I've thought a lot about. So some of this may be a little bit speculation on my part, but I believe that the individual is becoming more powerful in what they're able to do. The cost of destroying the world is rapidly decaying, such that very soon one individual that's very determined within their own little lab will be able to use this system called CRISPR-Cas9 to develop a bioweapon that can, well, it's going to be more destructive than a nuclear bomb. And essentially, once it's released, it can go across the world to destroy a large percentage of the mammalian population. And in order to counter this, there basically needs to be a surveillance program across the entire world. Because if anyone is not under this surveillance grid, they could create such a weapon and take out, let's say every single human in existence, or maybe a race-specific bioweapon that can take out, specific races on this planet. If you're an oligarch on the global empire, this is a very, very, very serious threat. And so I believe that in a way, the technology trends that we see are driving this decision to sort of take over society by force. A thing that's counterbalancing this is the fact that, we're creating these digital hive minds. Twitter's in essence a cybernetic organism, and the cybernetic organism is, producing counterintelligence against the bureaucracies of the last century that have essentially used top-down control over society. And as Plato said, those who control those who write the stories control the world. And essentially, the stories are being generated now bottom up. And essentially, I believe that the globalists see that they either have to act now or they're going to lose forever because of the power of decentralized hive mind collectives that are getting together in order to basically inform everyone on what's really going on. So right now, this is the biggest conflict. I think that this is driving the conflict to every single household across the world.
Well, I never thought I'd live to see the day that I would be cheering for the decentralized hive mind collectives, but they sound like the necessary lesser of evils. Didi Laugesen, I suspect that most of our listeners responded as I did to your description of the digital driver's licenses or mobile driver's licenses as a trap that has already been sprung upon us. As you said, by I think May 3rd of next year, everyone has to have one of these digital IDs. Is it the case that something can be done to, at least press for your states to make these digital documents less intrusive, less a vehicle for government control through software or the use of the data that they have access to?
Sure, Frank. I think a lot of people are finding that they're already engaged in these digital platforms. I myself, when the Real ID was starting to make its way through Colorado, I went to get my license renewed and found that my Social Security information didn't match with my driver's license, my birth certificate. I had for years been using my baptismal name, Mary, as my first name, went through college with it, everything. It was my ID. And instead, when Real ID came through and they started coordinating this information between Social Security and what was on file with the DMV, I almost lost my identity. I had to go find hospital records and other documents that would prove that I was both Mary and Denise, and marry them together. But it was a 9-month process in which I didn't have a legal ID. And then also, I went to take my son to an operation this past summer, and I was forced through a Smart Health ID program in order to take him in to have his surgery. So I had to create a Smart ID for my son, and there was no other option. The surgery was the next morning. They needed this information. There was no other option given. And so, we are being forced into these platforms, and as we've heard today, as they all come together and all these platforms become one centralized platform, the dangers of abuse, especially tyrannical abuse, continues to rise, Frank, and we are all seeing it in our daily lives.
Honey, let me put the variation to that question to you. I got a notice the other day that my power company is going to be installing smart meters. And I wasn't given any indication that you have an opt-out opportunity. So I assume that, like driver's licenses, we will all be required to have those installed. And I know they have been in many cities and counties around the country. Which raises the question that Dee Dee just put sort of at the end there. Will we find ourselves having government entities punishing those who are not conforming by reducing the electricity that they rely upon to heat their homes, or keep their food cold, or otherwise live their lives? We've been working at the Center for Security Policy for 20 years now, I think, on grid vulnerabilities. These have their own vulnerabilities, of course, but one that's top of mind given this conversation is the possible manipulation of this and other, for that matter, so-called smart digital wired technologies. Your thoughts about this? And again, do we have an opt-out possibility in any of this?
A lot depends on the state you're living in. Let me put this in some context. I've interacted with people from Silicon Valley firms for decades. And back when we used to discuss cute things like privacy, the response was, we're going to do what we want, and users won't care about it anyway. You can't stop us. We're a private firm. It is not inconceivable, as software takes over the world, that our power companies will start to develop a culture with that logic. Already, we've seen the smart meters used to curb electrical usage at all sorts of times outside of users' consent. The excuse given so far has been for grid stability. Even worse, the system of laws used to govern our grid are more than a century old, and many of those laws, depending on the state you're in, prevent you from being able to take yourself off the grid with supposedly green technologies. So you're stuck inside the system of control if you want, like, things like zoning permits for your house or for renovations that you do. So right now, unless people are willing to pay a very high opportunity cost to move themselves physically to a place where they're allowed to completely separate themselves from the grid and probably move themselves way outside of cities and suburbs and towns and the conveniences that we get from people agglomerating together and specializing in providing a smaller group of goods for one another instead of just for ourselves, there's a good chance that we will be trapped in the system. We need to start asking ourselves, how high a cost are we willing to pay ourselves in order to remain free? And that's part of the issue at Contest now.
Yes, it is. Well, Reggie Littlejohn, you've played a
Reggie
seminal
had
role.
to jump to get
she did.
on the war room. Yes.
I'm sorry. Well, we're glad she's there, needless to say. I think for the second time today, if I'm not mistaken. And I know she's been talking about this program, and I appreciate people tuning in now and in the future, thanks to Steve Bannon's encouragement at the War Room with Reggie's help. I guess maybe I would just address this question myself then. Have we taken anything away from this conversation other than the imperative need for pushing back against these technologies, these directives, these agreements, these decisions and policies that are being promulgated all around us? I think the answer to that has to be no. If we love freedom, and I'm sure the people tuning into this program do love freedom, it is facing the greatest existential threat, arguably, in the history of the world. I think Leo compared it to the Tower of Babel times. Maybe that's apt. It certainly stands to reason that the effort to create a forced sort of convergence that God found to be an affront and ultimately struck down is reminiscent of the kind of control that is now being sought by these various authoritarians, totalitarians, and their machines. We've learned now a shocking thought that you could be tried by an algorithm and punished effectively without appeal to a human at any level. The fact that this is a brave new world, if I could use that expression, that is being promoted in many respects, and we haven't exhausted the various ways in which the Chinese Communist Party's quantum computing and big data collection and its mining of that data and the surveillance state apparatus and the enforcement mechanisms and all the rest are at work now and are being served up as a model for what the rest of the world should be subjected to. But we've had a taste of it, and I think all of us will agree that it is not an appetizing proposition by any means. We're going to talk, the question was raised in the chat by one of our guests, is this the only program we're going to do this week from part of our Committee on the Present Danger of China enterprise? And the answer is no. Tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 2:15, we're going to be having our weekly program about the TikTok time bomb, the CCP's virtual weapons platform, and how it is being now wielded against Americans with potentially very devastating effects, not just for individuals, not just for their personal information and privacy, but for the national security of the United States as well. I hope you'll join us for that conversation tomorrow at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for it at presentdangerchina.org, and I encourage you to do so. With that, I think we'll break and thank this extraordinary company, Reggie Littlejohn, Dr. Robert Malone, Leo Homan, Zach Voorhees, Didi Laugesen, and Connie Elliott. Extraordinary resources. We appreciate so much your time, your mastery of these complex issues, and your help in teaching the rest of us how they all come together now in this dangerous new effort to impose upon us a digital gulag. For the time being, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much. Right, back to you, Didi Laugesen.
Thank you, Frank. This webinar has been playing on Clubhouse. After the webinar, audience members can join some of us there to continue the conversation. Here's the URL, and it's also in the chat. www.clubhouse.com/room/PD5WAI21. PD5WAI21. A video of this webinar will post to Stopbacks Passports within a day or two of the end of our program. Please share this with your colleagues and other networks, and especially with your elected representatives. Check back for more information on this and other upcoming programs. And while you're there, check out the Take Action tab for actions you can take to stop the advance of CCP-like tyranny being imposed during public health emergencies. And thanks again for being here.